Great. Welcome, everybody. I see that there's still a couple of people joining in, so give us a couple minutes and we will get formally started. Meanwhile, I'll introduce today's seminar and speaker. So I'm Anu Ramaswamy. I'm the faculty director of the Chadha Center for Global India. My own background is in interdisciplinary sustainable urban systems. And so I'm particularly delighted to welcome today Dr. Bimal Patel, who's an eminent architect and actually has been he's going to share with us 4 very exciting urban design projects in India. Let me give you a little bit of background about our center, and then I'll talk about today's program, our speaker, and our discussants. The Chadha Center is a relatively new center at Princeton University. We began in 2019. I joined here as the inaugural director, and we've been really thinking about how can we be interdisciplinary in our study of India and look at the interactions between India and the world that shape human and planetary well-being and our imaginaries of the human experience. And so I'm particularly glad with the interdisciplinary focus to be co-sponsoring, to be co-hosting this event with the Princeton Mellon Initiative. And together we'll have an engaging conversation with Dr. Patel about urban design in India with focus on architecture. So let me quickly speak a little bit about India. I think we all know this, but we anticipate 400 to 500 million more people to be joining urban India by 2050. And the sorts of changes that we're seeing in terms of sustainability, well-being, efficiency, economic development are all going to be tied up to India's urbanization story. And so that's why this topic is so relevant in terms of thinking about global India and how India is going to be in 2050. So by way of introduction, I wanted to say that, of course, Dr. Patel will show you all of the background behind some of these projects that you're going to see and hear about today. Dr. Patel is an eminent architect from India with over 35 years of research and teaching experience. He's the president of CEPT University that many of you know about in Ahmedabad, India, and leads HCP Design Planning and Management Private Limited, which is an architecture planning and management, project management firm. He also founded Environmental Planning Collaborative. It's a planning, research, and advocacy organization. You will hear from him. Some of his notable works are Parliament House and Central Vista in New Delhi, transformation of the Sabarmati Riverfront project. And I was just chatting with him that I had the pleasure of visiting CEPT and visiting this riverfront project way back, I think in 2016 or so, and several others. For his distinguished work, he received the Padma Shri Award, which is one of the highest awards given to civilians in India in the field of architecture and planning in 2019. So welcome, Dr. Patel. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have you here with us. Dr. Patel will talk for about 25 to 30 minutes about his projects. He'll give us some detail and walk us through them. And it'll be followed by a short discussion session between Professor Forrest Meggers, who's an associate professor of architecture and the Andlinger Center of Energy and the Environment, also affiliated in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And Forrest's interests are wide. He works on energy efficiency, radiant cooling design. He's actually been very active with our campus projects around getting to net zero heating systems. And so, Forrest, it's great to have you here with us as discussant. And I will round out the discussion. As I mentioned, I myself, I'm a civil and environmental engineer. And I'll be talking about the bigger urban system, particularly in light of the IPCC report. So we can discuss urbanization in a broader sense. So with that, I will switch over and invite Dr. Patel. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Let me see if I can share screen and get on with my presentation. Okay, so I've been foolish and I've tried to pack in 4 large and complex projects into this short presentation, short time that I have. And if I run out of time, just tell me and we'll stop because I think the discussion is important. But before I commence, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I hope you find what I have to say interesting and useful. So let me start with the first project, with the Sabarmati Riverfront Development Project. This is in Ahmedabad, and it's a revitalization, environmental improvement, social development project. Well, let me explain what this project is about. I started working on it in 1996. This is Ahmedabad at around that time. It's 5 million people, 300 square kilometers straddled on either side of Sabarmati, which you can see runs from north to south. Like most Indian rivers, the river had deteriorated over a period of time. It was a place to dump garbage, polluted by sewage, untreated sewage flowing in, encroached upon by informal housing, hemmed in by development, flood-prone, inaccessible. So not a very nice place at all. Also, one sort of a barrage built downstream in 1976, which is a long time ago, had turned the river in the middle of the city to a sort of a linear lake, a seasonal linear lake. And the water would be used up for irrigation, and then it would turn into a dry riverbed. This is not a perennial river. This is a monsoon-fed river. But after monsoon, we had a lake, and then not. We started with a comprehensive master plan in 97. We looked at everything from physical features of the river to hydraulics to financing, etc., and produced a report. After that, I was involved for 6 years for managing the project and bringing it up to a point at which it could be implemented. So I was a manager to the project, and my team, we were managing it for a while. So here's the river, as you can see, 11 kilometers of it in the middle of the city. This is in year 2001. The project hadn't started at that time. 2002, we had riots in Ahmedabad. This was also a bad year for Ahmedabad. Project hadn't started. Then in 2004, it commenced. And here you can see in 2006, the reclamation works already there. 2007, 9, 15, and presently. Projects like this are ongoing projects. It's not totally complete as yet, but a lot of the important works are all finished. So that's what the river looks like now, and that's sort of an aerial view of the river, and the riverfront on either side you can see. The project has 11 objectives. The very first one of it was to make the riverfront accessible to everyone. Now, as you can see here, earlier, the river was hemmed in by development on both sides, and it was impossible for people to walk along its edges. So the only place they could experience the river from was the bridges. And whichever points there were to get down to the riverbed were all choked up by informal housing. So the basic work here was to build embankments, drain the river, build embankments, and reclaim land, slivers of land on either side as a sort of a public realm. So we reclaimed 2 square kilometers of of land in the middle of the city and 11 kilometers of the river. So here's just an image of the reclamation works underway, you can see. And eventually what the project has ended up doing it has socialized a private riverfront and made it accessible to everyone. And the land is still being developed even now. So what used to be a riverbed like this with buildings coming right up to the edge now looks like this, and you have a public realm all along, parks, gardens, streets, various things. The second objective was to stop the flow of sewage into the river. And, we had big untreated sewage drains like this flowing directly into the river. This is like rivers across the world and certainly in India where you have sewage coming in. And here you have what we essentially did was to build interceptor sewers, tap the sewage that was coming into the river, and take it to the 2 sewage treatment plants that you can see downstream here. So this is the works underway. The interceptor sewage, interceptor line was built into the reclamation. And now the flow of sewage into the river has been almost completely stopped. Few works are pending, and so the water now is relatively clean. It's not sewage. The third objective was to replenish the river and recharge groundwater. So the river is a sandy bed, and it loses 7 mld of water every day. This is good news for groundwater recharge, but you need to keep adding water. And so the idea, which is not complete as yet, but underway, is to use treated water from the sewage treatment plants and put it back into the river so that Ahmedabad can have a sort of a perennial lake, a linear lake in the middle of the city. And this work is underway, and presently the water in the lake comes from afar, and it will come from treated sewage very soon because the other water is not available. The fourth objective was to provide housing for informal settlements along the river. So you can see there were slums like this on the banks of the river. Essentially what was done was to relocate the people from the informal housing on the banks of the river to these resettlement sites, which were colored red here. And they are in the middle of the city. It meant a bit of disruption, but eventually 11,200 households were relocated in purpose-built housing. So the housing, when it was built, looked like this. We did not have anything to do with the architecture of this place. Unfortunately, we would have done a better job, I think. But it's a lived-in place now, and it's certainly far better than the houses that people had on the riverbank, which were flood-prone. And there was no services like water supply, drainage, etc. So these are some images from there. Now, actually, 1,100 crore rupees, I don't know if that means approximately, I think, $150 million were transferred to 11,000 of Ahmedabad's poorest households. So this was a very large component of the project, which is to actually bring a subsidized housing to the poorest people in Ahmedabad. Fifth job was to reduce the risk of erosion and flooding. Now the river in monsoon gets a lot of water, torrential floods of this sort. Essentially, I mean, the catchment areas are controlled by dams, but even then, when the dams are open, you get a lot of water. So everybody who could had earlier on built their own private walls. Anybody who could afford it had built private walls. Now what the project has done is to give a common wall to everybody. You can see here in 2015, the flood water here and the lower promenade that you can see here where the trees are is submerged. And then when the water goes away, this is the situation after the flood. So the whole city has been protected from floods by this embankment, 11-kilometer embankment. Sixth job was to create riverfront promenades and parks. So here you can see people enjoying the water. In 2012, at the lower level, we have a pedestrian promenade of this sort. And the section of the river is pretty much like that in Paris, for example, but we don't have streets at the lower level. It's entirely pedestrian here. And the trees have grown since then, and this is it's brought, this is a clipping from the newspapers at that time. It brings lots of people come to this place, and people of all ages, all classes, etc. meet. So this is given a vast amount of public space to the city. Many parks have been built, like this one that you can see. This is a large 1.5 kilometer long park across from Gandhi Ashram. There are other parks like this one for children here, or this one which is got a flower garden, etc. So the project has added almost 1 million square meters of parks in the middle of the city, and in a city that lacks public space and parks. Seventh idea was to create cultural trade, social amenities. So here, for example, on the left-hand side is a large open-air market, which is essentially like a flea market, but for poor people. Okay, here you have all the stands that are there. It's the Sunday market. It's where the market is held every week, and it's this sort of place you can see. It's essentially for the poorer segments of the city. Also, there were displaced washer folk, so laundry complex was built, and this has much improved their business. Much of the land also is used for amenities like this sports complex here along the river, and this has this vast amount of sports complex next to a very dense residential area. Here's another sports field near a residential area. Gives a sense of the kind of facilities created. The eighth idea was to revitalize riverfront neighborhoods. Obviously, the development has an impact on neighboring properties, and plans have been drawn up for redevelopment of many of these areas. So here's just a quick simulation. Here's what the river used to look like in the early 80s. You can see here a dry river bed, trickle of water, buffaloes there, mainly sewage. It's not really water. And now it's changed into a place like this. You can see, at the back, you can see the restaurant there at the back. And eventually buildings like this will come up, maybe here. And the areas on the side will be densified and indeed, many developers have already, started building on both sides of the project. Now, its also idea was to improve Ahmedabad street network. You can see the red line here. That's the north-south link. So 20% of the land was used for adding this street, weaving in and out of the river. Here you can see the street on the two sides. That's the north-south link, as you can see here. Here's another view of the same thing. The 10th idea was to pay for the project. It's a completely self-financing project. It does not use tax money, it uses borrowings just now. But all this land colored in blue, which is about 14.5% of the total reclaimed land, is to be sold for development. The first building that has come up is this one here, and 14% of the land will be used for buildings like this. You can see that it has no compound wall. That's what most Indian buildings have, so the edge is clear. Now you can see the cost of construction for this entire project was about $196 million US. The cost of relocation housing was 144 million. Interest and other costs is 98. And revenues expected from this project, from the sale of land, is 459. The prices of land continue to rise, and so the project is financially very, very safe in a sense. The 11th objective was to bring Ahmedabad together around a large civic project, and here build its capacity to tackle complex urban problems. So here's me when I had black hair in '96. Explaining the project to stakeholders. A lot of work initially was about getting everybody involved in the project. In the city, here's a workshop for the professionals of the city. Here's an exhibition. There were many such. I'm just showing you a few pictures. Lots of people thronging by the model for the project. And, the newspapers get involved in this. And there was lively, contentious discussions about the project. Here's something about a Desi Manhattan in the making. And here's, of course, there were people who were worried about the project, had apprehensions, and genuinely concerned about many aspects. So here's somebody who went, who claimed that the historic market is going to get wiped out. And here's somebody who's worried that this is going to be entirely commercialized. So the newspapers became a place where a lot of these debates were held. And the High Court got involved. So it was a project that went through all the contentions that you might expect in a democratic society. And we had to develop special techniques of rendering to show, for example, what a place like this could eventually look like. So you can see here, that's the land that was reclaimed, and we made these renderings to explain what the place would look like, and then had large exhibitions of this sort to explain the project to people. And people would get involved in the discussions about this exhibition. So really, this project is about bringing the river back to the city and the city citizens back to the river, and that's what it's about. So I'll stop on this project at this point. Let me go to the next one. This is another large-scale project, the Central Vista project in Delhi. Delhi, in the center of Delhi, of New Delhi, is the Central Vista. You can see that in white, marked, the space marked in white. It was built by the British. Lutyens was the architect, and it was built as an icon for the Raj at that time. It was meant to be the living center of administration in India. This was the seat of government. So there was this gently sloping terrain on which a platform was created, on which a grid of streets, orthogonal radial streets were put, a lovely landscape, and then you have formal gardens on either side. This was inspired by Paris, Champs-Élysées, and Washington Mall, and then there was these avenues of trees here. And this was the vision of Lutyens, that there would be buildings on either side of the central processional route. But eventually he was able to build only this much. So by the time the Raj ended, only this much was built. And here's an aerial image of what the place looked like. So when India became independent, the whole place was appropriated by Indians. This is in 1947. The people took over the place. The government house, or the Viceroy's palace, became the Rashtrapati Bhavan, the President of India's house. The council house became India's parliament, and the government offices became ministry offices. So this is the icon of the government of India. But over the years, this place has been managed without a comprehensive, inspiring vision, and very poorly managed, actually. And so what used to be something like this now looks like this. You can see this sort of haphazard set of buildings that have been built on either side of this very, very formal landscape and street network. Now, it's a magnificent space even now. It's the seat of India's government, a heritage asset, a precious civic space. It's most visited tourist destination, but it's a hodgepodge of different administrative, cultural, legislative activities, many of which don't need to be here. All of government's ministries cannot be housed here because there's a lack of office space. There are old World War II barracks, these red ones here, you can see, that were never removed, and precious land is occupied by these barracks and jobs that don't need to be here. This is what the barracks look like next to magnificent heritage buildings. And the public access is diminished because of VIP movement. Then you have, it's very, very poor use of land. The government buildings have a sea of parking around them. Not a single additional square foot can be built, actually. Inside the offices are quite dispiriting, and 50,000 people work here, but it's really, really poor shape. There's inadequate office infrastructure. The air conditioning, window air conditioners guzzle a lot of energy. There's no air conditioning. These buildings were not meant to be air conditioned, so they are window air conditioners, and they guzzle a lot of energy. You see the architecture is quite incoherent everywhere. I mean, it's just separate set of buildings plotted out and built upon. All the old buildings are in terrible shape. So all of Lutyens' buildings have been added to and altered, and all the infrastructure put in there is destroying the buildings, has destroyed them over the last few decades. The landscape is quite lackluster. And many times of the year, these are sort of large lawns on either side. The streets are poorly managed, and poorly managed traffic and parking. There's not enough, there's a big national parade every year, but there's not adequate infrastructure. And the tourists this is the most visited tourist spot in Delhi, but it's inadequate facility. So there's not even toilets there. There's no place. So this place has been crying out for improvement for years. The Central Vista project basically aims to comprehensively transform this space to ensure that it serves its many different functions effectively. So it's a large project, and I've done talks which are available on YouTube. This is what Central Vista looks like today, and the master plan for it will turn it into something like this. So let me just go back once. That's what it is, and that's what it looks like. And there's a number of facilities to be built on either side, and parks and gardens to be done. So let me just explain I'm not going to explain these in detail. These are the objectives of the project. The first one is to modernize and expand Parliament's facilities. And let me just say this much, that next to that round building, which is the Parliament, we are building a new building, the triangular shaped building, which is the new building, new Parliament building. So the old building is the round building that you can see. It's quite inadequate for Parliament's needs. And this triangular building is the new one that is being built right next to it. And the two will work together. The old building will be restored, and its offices will be used. It will also have public places for people to visit. So that's what the Parliament complex will look like. The second objective is improving productivity and efficiency of administration. So that really is to be done through these donut-shaped office buildings that you can see. There are 9 large buildings and 2 small ones that you can see at the far right. And then there's the National Archives and a conference center. Once again, just to give you a quick idea, these are the buildings that you can see, the large office buildings there on the 2 sides. The buildings are large, each one with about 6,000 people working in them. There's a courtyard in the middle, and it's a very rational, efficient office building connected by an underground people mover connected to the metro. So it's a transit-oriented development, completely linked seamlessly with public transport. And the first 3 of these buildings are being built right now. Here's some images of what the buildings look like. That's like the entrance. And these are the workspaces inside, which are, straightforward, large work halls of this sort, overlooking into the courtyard in the middle. So lots of natural light, proper air conditioning, very efficient from an energy point of view. These are the offices inside. These are large ministers' offices. Not every one of the offices are that large. In the center, there's a big courtyard and places for people, for the staff here to work and have lunch, etc. So that's the courtyard in the middle of the building. So there's basic office buildings on 2 sides. There's also the National Archives of India here. So on the left-hand, in the bottom corner, you can see the old historic block with the 3 courtyards in it that was designed by Lutyens. It's a lovely building. On the right-hand side is a large block that we are building. You can see on the left-hand side, the historic building, and on the right-hand side, the large new archive block with all sorts of modern facilities. This is to replace a present annex, which is very poor condition today. I'm not going to talk about the conference center. It's not designed as yet. It's all a sequential thing. We have to build a few buildings, move people there, and then tear down older buildings and build new ones. That's the idea. Now, the third objective is strengthening cultural and recreational facilities. So there's museums, there's IGNC here, but let me just talk of this central space in the middle, which is a large and vast public space for national events. It's a precious civic space for Delhi's residents. You can see here people use it in a marvelous way, and tourists throng to it, as I told you earlier. But it's under much stress and in a state of disrepair. So we're basically keeping its structure the same. So you can see here, this is the road in the middle, and it had no stormwater drainage, it had no pavements, etc. And this was the sort of visualization of what we would do in its place. You can see it basically keeps the same structure, but we build pavings, we build stormwater drainage, we improve the infrastructure, LED lighting, etc. And that's the pathway under construction Most of it is finished. We added a lot of infrastructure below the pavement so that the national events can happen in a better fashion. And this time's Republic Day parade actually took place here, and everything was functioned quite well, as you can see here. The landscape is lackluster, and we want to add proper irrigation systems, because otherwise we were wasting too much water in growing these lawns. And so there are these lawns here that have been done, and the place is going to be thrown open to the public in another month or a month and a half. Places like this, where you had no pavements and walkways, and there were bald patches, the lawn, we said we would improve the canal on the right hand side, and you would have these sort of walkways with benches and trees. And here is the same thing that has been transformed with this landscape. So that's and places for vendors, where people can come and, the informal sector can sell here. There's toilets, amenity blocks, etc. Pedestrians have a rough time crossing streets, so we have underground passages that improve pedestrian connectivity. So a basic uplift and a basic refurbishment of this place. Also for the parade, they had no real infrastructure, so we're making this easier for them to hold the parade and not destroy the landscape. So instead of this sort of seating that used to be built every year that Indians are quite familiar with, build and break, we now have bleachers of this sort, and this time's parade use these sort of bleachers. The National Museum, this is actually the seat of the government right now, and powerful ministries sit there, and that will be converted to a museum. Now, ultimate objective is to, I'm not going to talk about 4 and 5, their work underway, protecting heritage, expanding public space, and changing the iconography of power here. So you can see here, this involves a few things. The green space here in the middle is what was publicly accessible space earlier. After the project is complete, the green space expands. So we're actually expanding public space when we develop the gardens here. These bastions of government are going to be turned into sort of great museums, national museums, because the ministry offices inside the building will be moved to the new office buildings that are coming up. So as you can see, this is sort of the whole project is sort of an upgrading and a transformation of the space without altering its basic structure. So it's heritage protection, it's an improvement of the environment. Third project I will talk about is the redevelopment of Mumbai port. This is still not underway, but the plan is fairly underway. You can see that's Mumbai, as you can see here. Here's a map of Mumbai, and you can see that's what's referred to as the island city of Mumbai. Of course, Mumbai is spread out way beyond. You can see here it goes beyond. But the original island city is 70 square kilometers. Now, out of this red colored area was the old port of Mumbai, and that's approximately 10 square kilometers of land. And through the 19th and 20th centuries, it was the engine for Mumbai's economic growth. And then, like most port cities, the port got choked by the growth of the city, and so the port has moved across the bay. There's a big container terminal called the Jawaharlal Nehru Port Terminal, and so this entire red piece of land is now underutilized. There's some port activities continue here, but most of it is derelict structures of this sort, vast open spaces that can be put to better use. There are many buildings that are getting encroached upon. So there's lots of informal housing here. There's immense amount of pollution here from whatever shipping is there. Vast pieces of land that can be better put to better use. And of course, it has a magnificent 11, 12 kilometer of sea area that Mumbai people simply cannot even access because it's part of the port. So this can be converted. Okay. Now, the other important thing about this piece of land is that after all these transport proposals, many of which are underway, like the Trans-Harbour Sea Link or the metro line or the railway line, when all of these get done, this is going to become one of the most well-connected places in the city. So you have 10 square kilometers of land in the middle of the city, and it's the best connected in a city which is dense and crying out for more space. So he presents a great opportunity to monetize a portion of this land. The land belongs to the central government. The shipping ministry manages it. And of course, it has to be done in a way that strengthens Mumbai. There's no question about that. So that was the real objective of the project. And we also saw in it an opportunity to demonstrate a new paradigm for urban planning for Indian cities. Okay. So we did a large master plan to start with. You have 10 square kilometers, and this is what our master plan looked like. That's not important. But here you are. Here's a model of how we propose the land might be used. Here's another model of the same thing. That's the redevelopment site number 1, which is about 2.5 square kilometers. Some of it is still going to be used as a port. So there's not all of the 10 square kilometers going to be developed. This is the most intensely developed 2.5 square kilometers. Now, I think there are many features of plan that I can talk about. I've done talks about this, which are also available on YouTube. But let me talk about just one aspect of this plan, which is that it makes a sensible use of land. I mean, I think there's many special features about this plan that demonstrate how we might do urbanization differently in India. But just let's look at one, the sensible use of land. Now, I want to say Indian cities make very poor use of land. Let me explain what I mean by this. This is Ahmedabad. I talked to you about this earlier. And those red squares that you see in the middle, if we were to study those, let's take one of these squares. It's 500 meters by 500 meters square. And if I studied one of them, which is in the center of the city, this is how we use land. The 500 meters by 500 meters is what you see a satellite image of on the left-hand side, and you see how typical Indian city looks like on the right-hand side. If you look at how the land is used, if you look at the public realm, which is streets and parks, only 17.2%, the gray colored area, is in streets and parks. So there's very little land in the public domain. If you look at building footprints, which is also something that is very important for a city, then only 25.6% of the land is under building footprints. So what's happening to the rest of the 57.2%? Now, that land is privately held land that private owners cannot statutorily use because of building regulations. So most of this land is very poorly utilized. All of that, 57.2%. Now, you took, just to show you what these places between buildings look like, it's all these colored slivers of land that you see here. They look like little slivers like this, little slivers of land like this. Anybody who's been to an Indian city understands what I'm saying. There's, buildings sitting in private plots with land all around, and all of that land adds up to 57% in this case. It's underutilized like this. You grow a few trees, but really it's very, very poor use of center city land. So these private open spaces are mandated by unthoughtful building regulations. They are mostly small, ill-shaped. They cannot be well used by private owners. They do not confer much public benefit. And I'd say it's very easy to conclude, or I think most people will conclude, that the allocation of land in Indian cities is very, very wasteful, which is why they seem congested, yet they do not have enough space for people. If you take Mumbai, this is the same story. This is the most precious land, the Nariman Point in Mumbai. And if you look at the piece of land here, this is where the wealthiest people of Mumbai have their offices. And you have 53.6% land just wasted in space around buildings in private plots. Now, if you look at cities that we admire, like London, you have a completely different story. You have 29.6% in the public domain, almost 35% of land in the public domain. Building footprints occupy 65%, therefore maximizing the amount of floor space that you can stack up on top of it. Private open spaces take up only 4.8. Admittedly, I mean, this is just one square. In San Francisco, you get a similar thing. You get large land devoted to building footprints, and public realm is almost 35%. So what we conclude is that Indian cities make land use of the kind that is on the left-hand side. You have in the public realm only 20-25%, building footprints is 20-25, and 50 to 60% suboptimally used in this space around buildings. And in well-planned cities, you would have 35-40. These are the cities we admire, Paris, Barcelona, San Francisco, etc., etc. Now, the plan for Mumbai Port shows how the cities can make much better, Indian cities can make much better use of land, and that's what we have done. Now, to explain what this is, let me try and do it very quickly. This is redevelopment site 1. This is 2.5 square kilometers. And if one were to look at it and compare it to the island city of Mumbai, the remaining island city of Mumbai, then the comparison looks like this. That's the island city of Mumbai. I told you it's 70 square kilometers. That's the port. So the remaining island city is 60 square kilometers. This is where redevelopment site 1 is, 2.5 square kilometers. And if you look at how the streets are, well, island city of Mumbai devotes only 17% to streets. No wonder its traffic is abysmal and is congested. While the development we propose uses almost 38% for streets. So it has a dense network of walkable streets, and that's what we've tried to do here. If you take green spaces, island city of Mumbai has 9% green spaces, large green spaces, publicly accessible green spaces, and our site has 32%. Okay. If you look at the building footprints, we were very conservative. We could have increased this. We have kept it at 22%, and the island city has 27%. Consequence, the distribution of land use compares somewhat like this. If you look at the public domain, which is streets and parks, we have put almost 70% of this land in the public domain, while adding as much floor space as you would have built in the city in the traditional way. So this was also addressed a political problem that we anticipated, but we can talk about it later. So it makes sensible use of land. Now, my last project here is the development plan of Ahmedabad. Just to give you a sense, this was done 2002 to 2012. This work we did in 99, I think. My claim is like this. Almost all Indian cities have statutory urban plans in place. They look colorful plans like this. This is Delhi. The previous one was in Mumbai. Then you'll find every city authority will have a master plan like this for Chandigarh. And then it will be accompanied by a whole set of building regulations. And, we have a lot of planning. The problem is, there are thick books like this, which have, lots of rules and regulations people are supposed to follow. The problem is that this planning simply does not work. Most proposals remain unimplemented. Zoning and building regulation compliance is low. If you look at most cities, peripheral growth is haphazard, unserviced. In-city redevelopment is disorderly. Legal housing is unaffordable. Informal settlements are widespread. Authorities are unable to tap into increasing land values. Most cities are growing in a disorderly manner. And indeed, all of this adds up to making for inefficient, unsafe, unjust, uncomfortable cities. That's what haphazard growth looks like. That's what informal housing looks like in a lot of our cities. That's the kind of traffic problems, congestion that we have. We have inadequate infrastructure that we need to build across these cities, and all the sewage treatment, etc., is not done well. And look, outside, the cities are growing very fast. Anu talked about India urbanizing. The cities are all sprawling out, and they're sprawling out in this haphazard manner without any land left over for streets in a disorderly, haphazard manner. And here you have Lucknow, and the previous one was Nagpur, and the previous one was Calcutta, and you could go to Google and look at how the cities are growing. Now, the planners blame everyone and everything for this. Okay, they blame political interference. They blame a lack of enforcement. They say, government is unable to enforce. They lack funds. They say they lack resources and staff. They blame the developers for the amount of power they hold and their greed. They say Indians are corrupt. They do not like to follow rules. This is a very common statement. Some even say capitalism is the problem. We need to be. So we don't think that. We think that Indian planning needs a paradigm shift. We need to do planning differently for it to work. Okay, and I do a talk where I talk of these 8 reforms that are needed. We need to accept that the future cannot be predicted. We need to focus on tasks that simply cannot wait until later. We cannot do everything at the same time. We need to limit the role of government in providing goods and services and focus on the most essential things. We need to make affordable standards. Our standards are imitate Western standards, and it simply does not work for the poor. We have to use planning to raise resources. We have to make plans that are fair. Indian planners are just not concerned with fairness. They want to do, they think that citing public interest is enough to take away people's private property. They don't take the value of land into consideration. They don't even bother to explain their plans to people. Now, we had an opportunity to test these ideas in 2002 when we did the development plan for Ahmedabad. It was a city-wide plan. We abandoned the traditional approach inspired by the famous license permit Raj of India. We used a liberal and fair approach. The result was there to see after 10 years. The development authority, unlike any authority in the country, was able to appropriate land, raise revenues, implement its proposals, and ensure compliance. I could do a whole talk on what they were able to achieve. But the proof of planning working is that it should be able to ensure orderly growth. And let me just show you a few images to say what I mean. Now that's Ahmedabad, and that's the periphery of Ahmedabad here. And that's a 5 kilometer by 3 kilometer rectangle, 15 square kilometers, which was primarily in the year 2000 agricultural land like this. It lacks access, it doesn't have infrastructure, its values are rising fast. The city is going to grow into this area. And normally in most Indian cities, it would grow haphazardly. Here you can see in 2001, the street grid has appeared here, and slowly buildings are developing, more street grid here. This is orderly growth, as orderly as it gets in India. You can see here, by 2013, you have, the authority has been able to appropriate land for the streets, for raise resources, and ensure that everybody is building in an orderly manner. Now, this was an outcome of more effective planning. That was just a diagram of the development plan. And, if you take that square here, it was first the main streets were done, and then what we call town planning schemes were done. So that's it. Thank you very much. I'm done with what I have to say. Sorry for taking so much time.
Oh, thank you. This was just a wonderful, wonderful presentation and gave us such deep insight and really rich insight. And I love the contrast you've drawn both across cities, particularly when you showed Ahmedabad versus other cities, and also the before and after. It was really illuminating and
Thank you.
Really wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you.
We have about 45 people in the audience, so I want to make sure that everyone puts in their questions, and I'm going to give Forrest Meggers the opportunity to go first to have a small discussion before we open it up.
Thank you so much, Anu, and thanks for the wonderful talk. I think it's fascinating to see how much change you are basically forced to deal with, and the pace at which that change is taking place. I'm wondering if you could comment maybe on how you navigate sort of resource allocation at the scale of an urban plan, and then sort of at the scale of like the individual conversation with the stakeholders, because I think you did that in a unique way, where that you presented situations where there were conversations at the level of the community. And I have a personal interest in issues around like site access that you showed is very important, but also how certain development techniques actually make public spaces less accessible in terms of their like thermal discomfort and heat stress that happens in outdoor areas. And I think that is something that doesn't get discussed very often. And maybe to refine that question a little bit in terms of how you talk to people versus the large scale plan, I'm curious about the way in which synergies that aren't necessarily economic, so the way the trees may make the place more usable, can get translated to the community, but then may not. It's really difficult to make the economic argument, right? I mean, that's the way I often find it. I think you've done that in an interesting way. Maybe you've had maybe there's an anecdote you can give us about how those conversations about non-economic co-benefits and synergies and what you're doing can be translated between the scale of the urban plan and then activating the stakeholders mentality.
I'm not entirely certain I understand the question, but let me just attempt saying something about this. A lot of the projects that we are doing is new. That kind of change and that kind of planning is new for Indian cities. For many years, Indian cities have basically been neglecting their public spaces, neglecting their problems, and it's only since last couple of decades that India started realizing that its cities are important and that things. So we have some very basic discussions and some very basic problems. Like how are you going to stop the sewage from flowing into the river? And you've done that, you've got great environmental improvement, that first cut. What we try to do in all the projects is to leave enough space for things to happen over the years. Take the riverfront project, for example. Many people, the riverfront project no riverfront project gets complete. You need to do some basic work to start with, and then people will keep adding layers onto it. And so we were very keen that we leave enough space for parks and gardens. Not all the parks and gardens have been built. We had, we said we needed lots of trees. We weren't able to do that well enough in the sense that we left space for trees. But the planting was of poor quality. So 5-6 years down the line, we realized that there's no traditions of these things. So you realize that the trees are not growing, and then you look at it, oh my God, we didn't clear the construction debris properly, and so the trees are not growing. They're very basic things. Listen, this is, take the riverfront project. It's $160 million to spend on 11 kilometers of riverfront. You'll barely get a building like that, in that money in the US, right? So this is very basic and very simple. And you're trying, we had a lot of flood protection problems here. So we had to have, this is a sandy river bed and sandy bank. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but, it's pretty basic. We're taking the first steps here, is, if I may put it that way. And getting everybody on board about this is it's a challenge, but getting a few examples in place has been our main mission.
I think it's very clear. No, I think exactly.
There are a few things done, and already people are talking this can be done better. I say, okay, great. Let's see how it can be done better. But till then, you don't have anything. And energy issues, yes, of course, we address them a lot. Entire Delhi project is about reducing energy use in office buildings. We'll just the office buildings just now are guzzling energy, and you don't have comfort. You'll use almost, say, 40% energy on the buildings, so on and so forth. These are very basic. I often say that we have the kind of problems that the United States had in the 19th century, and that's what we are dealing with. We're dealing with vast amounts of growth. We have to manage that growth in an orderly fashion. We don't have money for infrastructure, so we got to do what we can. Leave space for streets. The most important thing, they can be paved later. Don't even have to pave them just now. But if you don't have space for streets, my God, you're going to get nothing afterwards. So very basic and fundamental problems have to be dealt with. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I don't know if I
follow up just on that, and I'll catch up with one of the questions as well. Just the topic of orderly growth and the town planning scheme that you just talked about in Ahmedabad. Other cities in India have tried to various degrees of success the town planning scheme. I'm curious what lessons do you think can be translated to other Indian cities? And are they translatable? Is there something else about the institutional arrangements in Ahmedabad that made this possible? And very related to that is a question in the chat, talking about translation across countries. So the last question, and so I'll just couple these questions. The last question is from Aaron Skuda, who says, New York is currently undertaking a controversial redevelopment of the lower Hudson River waterfront. What lessons can US planners learn from your project? So I just coupled a few questions. What can you translate across cities? Is there something unique? Because in many ways, even there are many examples in Ahmedabad that have worked well, maybe in Gujarat and Maharashtra, TPS has been written about, but not elsewhere. And then this fascinating question from Aaron, what is translatable across countries?
Let me start with the easy one, which is the town planning schemes. Town planning schemes were invented by the Brits. This is not something that and it used to be done across Maharashtra and Gujarat, and was never really took root in the other parts of the country. And Maharashtra abandoned its use and now is reviving its use. So there are lots of town planning schemes being done in Maharashtra. There's no better way of appropriating land that India knows of. Eminent domain is just much too expensive, doesn't work, and this is unfair. Because you take from some and create public benefits for everybody else. So here's a brilliant British invention, in a sense, to appropriate land in a fair way and distribute the costs and the benefits across. I don't see a better way than this being done. I think the central government understands this. Land and planning is a state subject, so it is trying to promote the use of TP schemes across. We are supporting many other states in their learning. The first one is always difficult, and I cannot imagine that 10 years down the line we'll have many more people doing it. Already there are many states struggling trying to do it. It's nothing unique about Gujarat. You can do this in Tamil Nadu very easily. You can do it in Karnataka very easily, and indeed everybody is struggling to do it. There's a big learning curve, so that's town planning schemes, and it can these lessons can be taken across many cities in India. About learning lessons from Indian cities, I wouldn't hazard that. I stayed 5 years in California, and I was my PhD is from Berkeley, and that was 30 years ago, so that's a long time ago. And I haven't really given it that much thought about. I really don't get into conversations like this very often, because that's what I'm working on. But I'm always struck by how much how much we are able to do with how little, and perhaps that's a lesson the whole world can benefit from.
That's very, very true. So thank you for that. I'm going to read off some of the questions. We have a lot of questions in the chat. So in the interest of keeping the discussion, I'm going to club a few questions together. But here's a question from Aman Roy, and he's saying that Lutyens Delhi was designed at a time when the British Raj was undergoing a political crisis, a crisis of legitimacy. The capital was shifting, revenue was buckling, and there was a crisis of coordination. And the pandemic infinitely postponed economic growth, rocketing commodity pricing. So basically he's asking, how do you contemplate your role as an architect in producing an architecturally symbolic structure that represents sort of public events, an architecturally symbolic event whose public interest surmounts the scale of your previous projects?
Once again, I'm not entirely sure I get that. But when people ask me, what is this project meant to signify in a sense? And I say, listen, the very first thing it should signify is a resolve to tackling long-standing problems. In India, we've got so used to not tackling these problems. So I showed you what the space is like, what the problems with its with it are, and just that, okay, we're going to, roll up our sleeves and get to work and do them. So that's, I think, the first thing we need to start working on. We need to take a sort of a problem-solving approach to whatever we have and keep going ahead. This is not a big iconographic project, but it does do a very important thing for the iconography of that space. Without changing it much, what we are doing is converting what used to be the bastion of government. I mean, government sitting up there, first the Raj, then the Indian government, sitting up there atop the hill, sort of looking down at the plains, the people sort of coming up to it in a sense. Now we're changing that and saying, well, the hill belongs to the people. So it's like that Champs-Élysées and Louvre sort of movement where the Palace of the King gets converted into something that you can go visit with your kids. I think that's perhaps the most important signifying objective of, or signification objective of this project. The rest of it is, I think, pales in comparison. What we're doing is reversing that equation or that signification of power there, saying that this represents an establishment or deepening of the republic, if you will. I hope I'm not being too ambitious with this, but what you're basically saying, what used to be the Palace of the King, that's where the most powerful ministry sat. You went up there, gaped at it from outside and wondered what went on inside. Well, you are now going to change that and you're going to turn it into something different.
A couple other questions are on the environmental front. One of them is from an anonymous poster, but they're asking what type of ecological studies were done. Independent ecological assessments done on the river ecology. Doesn't construction further disrupt the ecology? And what is the impact on river flows downstream of the embankment? And the same, I believe a similar poster also asked about your negotiation process, both with the government, and there's another question on the slum redevelopment. What type of, maybe if you can share more about the in-situ slum redevelopment process itself. Thanks.
Let me start with the environmental. So, of course, an environmental impact assessment was done before the river project was done. In Ahmedabad, that was not the biggest area of concern for most of the sort of civil society organizations, because the river was in such awful environmental condition that it had sewage in it, and and the banks were getting washed away, and people's properties were at risk, and many areas would get flooded when you would have the monsoon floods here. So, really stopping the flow of sewage into the river was a big environmental move, and restoring the river had already become a lake by the time we started the project. Because of a barrage that was holding water for irrigation, downstream irrigation. So it was already a seasonal lake, and with seasonal lake with sewage flowing into it and without access. So it was a sort of an obvious environmental improvement there. There was, but it was also transformative because it was being converted into a linear lake so it was not going to be a river as in the old days, but from a sewage-filled lake into a cleaner lake is what we were doing it. So that was not the major concern. The major concern was with the riverfront households. There were lots of informal settlements there, and there were many. Ahmedabad has, proudly has many civil society organizations which sort of stand up for the rights of the people. So it was clear right from the beginning that that these are the people that we'll have to talk with. And indeed, when the project was first defined, we worked along with SEWA, which is the sort of premier organization in Ahmedabad, looking at slum communities, and they basically what we were proposing before we went ahead. course, later on it changed a bit because originally, since there was no clear guarantee from the government, found alternative plots of land and housing was built. Now, 11,000 households moved, and each getting an apartment worth 10 lakh rupees, which is 10 lakh is a million rupees apartment. And so all of this was overseen by the High Court. So they got involved. There were NGOs that were involved. Like all these processes, doesn't work seamlessly. The fact that 11,000 households moved without the government getting toppled or without the courts stalling the whole thing is testimony to the fact that it was, something was working out there. I don't think there's a project. I mean, here's a project where almost as much money that was spent in construction is used in creating relocation housing. So, this is a project that brings subsidized housing to the poorest household, because the riverfront had the poorest households, of course, and gives them housing. So in that sense, it has worked out quite okay. That's, nobody, initially the costs for the slum dwellers is high because there's a disruption in their lives, but the benefits pile up over. So now if one were to go to many of these housing colonies, all the people will say, thank God that this happened, because this was a big leg up in their life. So by 11,000 houses, 50,000 people moved. That doesn't happen. In India, you cannot do that if you're doing it unfairly or but there were a lot of negotiation. I think the civil society organizations across the country play an important role in holding government accountable. I think that's very important. There's sometimes when, the best organizations in that lot are the ones that are genuinely interested in bringing some benefits to the poor and willing to compromise and negotiate, and don't make an ideological issue about it. There were ideological people too, but when the poor see benefits coming, then they say, yeah, there's something in it for me. So a project like that, and the main thing for a project like in India, people have all sorts of stories about India, but if you want to do projects, you must do them so that they distribute costs a little more fairly across lots of people. You cannot put costs on just one group. You will not make projects move that way. And you cannot, benefits also have to be for everybody. And you can't do it just for the poor, just for the rich, just for the developers, just for the, you have to find ways in which you build everybody's interest together. That's the design for the project, in a sense. And how you use the land, for example.
Could you also just to follow up, because I think people may not be familiar that most of the relocation was done within the city. So it was not peripheral. They were, able to access their workplaces.
Let me
just speak more to that.
Yeah. So what happened was there were old tech in the city. There were, this was a textile city, and all the textile mills had gone defunct, and the textile mill lands, like the port land of Mumbai, was now islands within the city. And through the development plan of Ahmedabad, we had ensured that half that land comes to the city. That land, most of that land was used to create relocation housing for people. Now, this was often sometimes 2, 3, sometimes 4, 5 kilometers away from where they were. So initially, this is disruptive. For a poor person, even a 2-kilometer move, you're adding vast costs to their budget. And they have to take a bus now, where earlier they could walk somewhere. So initially, if you go to ask people, but it all settles down because you're now going to spend less money on healthcare, on rent, on protecting your hut when the river floods and during monsoon. So it's a completely different economy over a period of time. Most importantly, you're certainly not a slum dweller. You have a house, So the most wonderful stories are when you hear these families and they say, that's, we could make a better marriage for our kids because of this fact. I mean, these are the benefits. So we're talking very, very simple things here. Initially, of course, I went hoarse trying to explain to people that the benefits will come. These costs are important. But
you did make this comment that I enjoyed where you said, if I did the architecture, it would be better on your slide showing the picture. And I mean, I appreciate that, because I wonder if you would just say whether, do you think you could build it better for the same price though? I mean, that's really the challenge, right? Because it inherently looks, it always looks, it looks sort of inexpensive, I guess, for lack of a better term,
I am interested in that particular problem of how do you do, I mean, this is really inexpensive construction. There's nothing there for any unnecessary flourish. And we do a lot of housing like that, and for the government. In this case, we could not do it because of certain administrative reasons, etc. And the government used cookie cutter plans to do it. I've done lots of housing. I have another talk where we explain what's the kind of stuff you would do if you had no money and wanted to improve. So through design, could you improve really low cost housing? And indeed, there is ways to do it. So there's a lot of scope for architects to do that.
Did those people feel the need to then buy air conditioning in these homes? Because we found that when you build this type, then you place a heat burden on them that didn't exist in the informal housing. And I was wondering whether that happens because these concrete buildings just get really, really hot. And then I think this is one of the trade-offs that I think people don't discuss often enough that I'm personally interested in. But I think, that the cookie cutter design is maybe the problem.
If you move from a house with a tin shed into a concrete house, you're not worsening your problem by much. That's first. Second thing, it's in Ahmedabad in summer, it's already 42 degrees here. Everybody is going to get air conditioning as soon as they can afford it. We can improve energy efficiency of buildings. That needs a lot of cost for insulation and things like that, which we can barely afford to spend right now. But I can see that as incomes rise, and they have been over just the last 20 years, as incomes rise, as there's money, and it makes sense, people will save energy. I mean, it's as simple as that. Yes, just now you're moving from a tin shed roof, which is practically sitting out in the sun, to a second floor of an apartment. You're a little better off if you have a little bit shaded, but not much. You don't increase the problem by too much. But yes, we can design it. We can have more trees. We don't need to do it in this way. I completely agree with you. There's lots of interesting ways in which you can improve energy use or efficiency.
That's a great question, and actually was exactly on my mind when talking about heat stress and moving vertically. Two other questions are from Chandana Anusha, who's one of our postdoctoral fellows in the architecture program, jointly appointed actually with the Chadha Center. And two questions, they're slightly different, but I'm going to read them both out. The first one, thanks you for the talk, and says, I'd love to know more about your mentors. Who are your sources of inspiration, people, scholars, practitioners who have influenced your own intellectual trajectory, and how has that changed over time? That is, how have your own ideas of space and land use changed through your career? And the second question is, we've talked about coastal spaces in India's big cities, but how do you think about coastal spaces in smaller cities where much of urbanization is happening? How do you envision planning in those smaller urban areas? Thanks.
Let me take the second one. we're doing a little bit of work. My colleagues are doing most of it now in a place called Daman, for example, where it's a coastal town, Union Territory, and same approach, same attitude. You can plan, you can make it more orderly. Just now it's a mess. And much of what we are doing in India is some basic cleanup in a lot of these places. And yes, you would do it in smaller coastal towns. You try to preserve as much as possible the ecology as you can. But we are going to get in some places urbanization. How do you do it sensibly? As I said, if you use land more sensibly, then you will have smaller footprints for cities. And that could, there could be nothing more important than that. So sprawling out and using land poorly. I don't know if I answered that more, but I would have to, we have to sit on specific things. As far as who my mentors were and people that I learned from, perhaps the most important teacher in my life was a Jesuit priest. I went to a Jesuit school in Ahmedabad. St. Xavier's, for those of you who are Indians, understand what St. Xavier's means. 8th grade to 12th grade was a Jesuit priest who ran the Social Service League. He got us engaged in problems of took us out of our comfortable middle class homes and then got us engaged in work in various different parts of the city. And he said, listen, it's like a mission to improve things wherever you saw problems. So perhaps that was my most important teacher. But I'm blessed. I've had wonderful teachers, both at CEPT. There were a number of practicing people. The most important, of course, was my father, who's an architect, a well-known practitioner here. He was trained at Cornell, nearby where you are, and in '56 and came back, set up a practice. So he was an important person that I learned from. There were other great practicing architects in the city. Toshi used to be here and used to have a big practice, still here. So these were people, inspiring people to learn from. Berkeley was a terrific place. He gave me a chance to do a liberal education after my professional education. So I studied with a lot of people. I read a lot of Marx at that time, came back to India and had my brush with bureaucratic socialism and decided to change my mind about all of these things. And got down to the task of really getting something done. But there, one of the most important teachers was Alan Jacobs, who was a practicing urban designer. And so, the sense that you actually grappled with public problems and tried to solve them was him. I was the first person to work with him on the Great Streets book that he has written. Some of you might be familiar with that. And Manuel Castells, sociologist. I was his teaching assistant for three years. Learned a great deal from him. So I've been blessed. I've had great teachers. Some of the best teachers have been my clients, as they knock me on the head and say, you aren't making sense, And so it's learning all the time, all the while. So thank you for that question. Gets me to remember all my teachers.
That was truly a good question. I'm going to actually jump off from that question to think about the future generation of planners in India. Exactly like you talked about your mentors. Could you talk about scaling up planning education? There are not that many institutes, and here we are expecting 400 million new urbanites, and just generally education, training, and scaling up from your perspective.
Yeah, 10 years ago, I decided to start working at CEPT as lead CEPT, and my intention was to precisely tackle these issues and say, listen, How do we improve the training of our professionals, for architects, urban designers, planners? How do we get them, equip them better with better abilities, better problem-solving abilities to go out there and tackle the big problems that face us? And so there's a vast number of things we have done, but you're absolutely right. There's very little that, I mean, by way of institutions. I mean, we train vast numbers of architects, but we don't, there's sort of quality issues right across. And what SEP does is holds up an example of how you might actually train people. We're also scaling up. We have scaled up, and over the years, there will be more scaling up. India, I never tire of telling people that here in India, you're trying to run a small institution, and I went to Berkeley, and the economics class had 1,000 students in it. So it is possible to scale up. You don't need to do things really small. You can scale up and still have good quality. And those are the sort of lessons that Indian institutions need to learn. We haven't paid any attention to that, because a lot of this higher education was all about elite education and how to make it more accessible, how to make it more available, and more focused on the problems of that people are going to face when they get out. So yeah, there's vast. We can do a whole evening full of chats about that. Thank you for that question. Sorry, I can't hear.
I was muted. I was just saying we should actually bring you back again and then have these discussions on the education
system.
I'd love to do that. A few more questions. I just want to be mindful of time. We have 5 more minutes left. And let me ask a few of them together, just so that we can combine them. I don't want to have anyone who put in a question not have an answer. Wonderful dialogue with Chandana that you can read, but I'm going to talk about some of the earlier questions, and I'm going to read them all. One of them is talking about riverfronts like Ganga, Yamuna in northern India carry a lot of cultural significance. And can we translate the Sabarmati development projects to such culturally significant locations? And I think you already have an example, so I'm looking forward to your answer. A question from Vinay Sitapati, who's a visiting faculty member, and in fact, who really made this connection. So I want to thank Vinay for introducing us to Dr. Patel. But Vinay is asking, to get large urban development projects requires working with politicians, officials, and bureaucrats. How do you tackle that? It's very close to the next question. With so many public projects, you've interacted with a wide range of officials. What has been your experience? You've talked from municipal corporations to the Prime Minister. What is your experience in communications? And then we'll circle back to a couple of follow-up questions from Chandana.
So if you want to work on public projects, public space, if you want to work on public realm problems, you have to work with the government. There's no question about that. And it's and I've done lots of work at the municipal level. I used to enjoy that immensely. I've done lots of work at the state level, and now lots of work at the central government level. It's a huge learning curve. Most private practices, like working with anybody, like working with developers or like working with industrialists, you have to know the terrain. You have to know what this issue is about. So, people say, I spent a lifetime working with politicians, with administrators, with civil society organizations to get many of these projects done. And it's a big learning curve. I think we need scores of practices of this sort. Unfortunately, we don't have enough of that. We don't have enough people truly wanting to engage with government and learn how to do that successfully. And the government also does not understand that it's simply not going to have the capacity to deal with problems unless it creates a private sector that it can rely upon to help it solve the problems. Necessity will we'll make it happen as we go along. And I think I see many more practices trying to deal with government and work with government. It's like any other client at some level, but sometimes very different sort of challenges. And I've had, I've worked with, in my architecture practice, I've worked with institutions, I've worked with developers. I sort of wanted to know what it's like in all of these different areas and what kind of problem is posed by them. So I can say it can be done. And it can be done well, it can be done, while keeping your professionalism intact. It's absolutely possible to do that. And that's important for people to know and to set an example for that sort of thing. Yes, how do, I forgot the other questions related to that.
So the other question was on cultural significance of rivers. So beyond the Savarmati.
Oh, right, okay.
And I thought you had an example.
I do a talk about the Savarmati, a longer talk about the Savarmati. First slide says every river is different. Every city is different. And every river and city needs a different solution. So please don't take this to mean I'm going to take this and put it into, that it's translatable straight away. It's not. But we all also have similar problems. All the rivers have sewage flowing in, all the rivers have slums there, all the rivers have lack of public access, etc., etc. And so you can learn from examples and see how things were done here. And we are indeed working on a couple of other cities, mainly now my colleagues working on it in Pune and in Surat. And there are different solutions. They're not the same. We worked on the Ganges, but it's a very small project on the Ganges. It's 40,000 square meters of land that fronts onto the river. So it's not a riverfront project. I think we've done I'm waiting for the construction to complete on the Kashi Ghat. So I think a nice ghat that's coming up, but that's not a riverfront project. That's just one ghat. That's just an architectural sort of intervention.
Great. Well, on that note, I think we have to call to close this very, very rich discussion following a very wonderful talk. So Dr. Patel, thank you again for your time, for joining us. It's later in India. And thank you, Forrest, for helping moderate the discussion.
It's wonderful.
And we had an excellent audience. So just thanks for all the audience questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Vinay for setting this up.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. I'll just close with a couple of announcements of our upcoming talks. So we have 2 more talks coming up on next week, and I'll share a quick slide if people could stay, because you'll get to know the locations of these talks. So the next upcoming talk is it's on climate, and it's on Monday, I believe, coming up next week. Let me just put up the location. Sorry that it always takes me a little bit of time to switch. But here you go. So as we thank our speaker, just here's a look at future events. We have Mr. Amitabh Ghosh, Dr. Ghosh, talking about the great uprooting, migration, and movement in the age of climate change. And we have a nice panel following, this is celebrating Earth Day on 22nd, talking about both climate justice and environmental justice and what is the intersection between them. So I'm hoping all of you will join us. And once again, I want to thank Dr. Patel and Dr. Meggers for this wonderful presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.